Hello, I'm the Archangel Daniel, and in this video we're going to discuss how God created planets, part 1. So, the ultimate survival story is how God survived in that first dimension where he was created. Now God found that after he'd been created, the chamber ran out of air and he died of asphyxiation. He found in soul form he could drift through the rock that was made of wormhole element. He could drift through that and find his way outside. And when God was outside, he found himself in a vast zero gravity environment of vacuum. So the one thing that God had was that fragment of gravity element. And God then decided he wanted to build a house, a place to live, and a family. So God found that he could manipulate the wormhole element, and it produced wormhole exit points with particles. He found a way to refill that chamber with air by using the wormhole element and the gravity from his hands. So he could refill the chamber with air, and then God found a way to refill his soul with a new body. And all it required was him influencing the wormhole element with the gravity from his body. It would start the process of filling his body, which takes 8 seconds. And then he'd have a new body. And then he would just float around in there. And then in order to survive, he was able to influence the wormhole element to produce particles that he could consume, which formed as a type of biscuit, which is called manna. So manna is the food for the soul, and that's how God survived. God was still hungry and thirsty even though he had manna, but it kept him going. So the first thing that God discovered was he needed to be able to see in the dark. Everything was done by feel. And then one day God produced some particles, and they bonded together, and then God produced a different sort of particle, and they bonded to the ones that he just produced that were of a different element, and this produced a work light. The work light emits light but no heat. It is still going to this day. So it emitted a lot of light, and God then used that light to help him see what he was doing in the darkness. God then found a way to produce heat. So he made a furnace, which is a tube shape, and he cut the inside with wormhole cutting and was able to line it with some particles that reacted to another type of element, and that was like a catalyst, and this element that was introduced through a wormhole then produced a reaction, which is how a star works. So this was God's furnace, and with the furnace God produced heat, and it was a type of beam. You could not go in front of it, it was extremely hot. And then eventually God produced a dimension full of fuel and was able to keep that furnace going as long as he wanted by using a wormhole. And you could turn it on and off by turning on and off the furnace wormhole. So God produced a type of wormhole exit point that produced particles that would bond together when heated in the furnace and produced molten rock, So that's where all the molten rock in this universe comes from. God then decided to make a giant ball and made a shell. And so that's the shell for a planet. And then later God found a way to produce gravity element using wormholes with particles. And the gravity element God found he was attracted to, and everything was attracted to. It was difficult to work with at first. This led to the gravity element being used on the shell underneath, and God could stand on top of the shell because of the gravity element. God then produced layers of particles and burned them with a furnace, producing thick layers of molten rock, and was then able to, by using wormhole cutting, carve tunnels and chambers into the rock. And that was a place God could go into. God was then able to produce a wormhole with air and fill the chambers with air. And this God kept going so that there was always air to breathe. Later God found a way to get rid of the carbon dioxide. Inside these chambers, God constructed chambers of creation. And the early works of this is the smaller skeletons that people believe are evolution of humankind. They're not evolution of humankind, they're God's earlier attempts at making a family. God was trying to make a similar species to himself. Exactly the same species as himself, a family. So they had a planet and it had gravity and it had air. God found that he could produce wormhole exit point with water. So God made a hole, sort of a trough, and filled it with water and was able to drink it. Then when God created the first batch of angels, the Gabriels, they were able to drink water. Everyone was naked. Clothing hadn't been invented yet. The heating situation, God heated it with uranium, but then later found it was extremely poisonous and volatile, and got rid of it and replaced it with something else. Those tunnels are still radioactive. You cannot go there. And what God later did was, what they found was that manna would keep people alive for quite a long time, even though they're in a radioactive environment. I am the Archangel Daniel, and I'm from heaven.